Hey everybody, Boris on VK Forex. Welcome to the weekly technicals for the majors for Euro dollar, dollar yen, pound dollar for Ds 10 to Ds 14 2018. And really the story of the week as we enter into the new week is going to be waiting for the move. We are at these very, very key levels in some of the majors, essentially looking for the big unwind stories next week, which are really going to be driven primarily by the UK story of Brexit, and then end of the week by the European ECB story and the Fed, which really comes on the week after, but the market is probably going to start anticipating the Fed moves this week as we move along. So interestingly enough, I think what's fascinating as the week comes to a close is how weak the dollar has performed. Today, as we go to the close, we have very, very weak U.S. non-farm payrolls, missed both on a headline number. The average hourly earnings were weak. All of it continues to suggest that we had peak growth in Q2 and we're starting to really slow down. And that is the big question. You know, going into 2019, everybody was absolutely convinced the Fed is going to be hiking at least twice, perhaps three times more. Now, as you're watching the feeds, not only is the market convinced that there's going to be a complete pause after December, there's now an open question as to whether the Fed is even actually going to hike in December and tip the U.S. yield curve into a full inversion. So it's fascinating because all of it just creates an enormous amount of downward pressure on the dollar, despite the fact that there's lots of problems across the globe, including in Europe as well. So Euro really held bid today, and we'll take a look at the charts. I'll show you how the 113 has really turned out to be a very, very decent support after several forays into trying to test it. And now, as we approach this week, the big question is going to be whether we can break out the 1450, which really creates a much stronger positive bullish signal on the Euro. Dollar yen, on the other hand, succumbed to the 113, and now it's really going to be a question of whether we can hold the long-term trend at the 112 level. A lot of it is going to depend on U.S. equity flows, U.S. bond flows, and whatever commentary we get out of the Fed, although we're not going to get any more commentary because now we're going to be in the quiet period ahead of the FOMC meeting. The shocker will be is if the FOMC decides to not raise rates in December, as it perceives the U.S. economy slowing down so much that a rate hike could actually endanger the growing expansion. So we'll see what happens. But certainly, I think dollar yen is vulnerable to more downside pressure from the fundamental factors. And cable, well, you know, we're going to get the Brexit vote on Tuesday. It's going to be fascinating. I mean, the story with cable, of course, is there's three scenarios. Scenario one, they pass PM May's plan, which would be bullish cable, because that essentially means the UK remains in the European Union for all de facto purposes. And we could certainly see a massive rally off of that if the Parliament passes. The problem is that that's a very, very small chance it's going to happen. There seems to be massive rebellion from both sides of the aisle against her plan, and there's a very serious chance that the plan fails. The question then is, a failure of the plan, is that positive or negative? And it really goes either way, because if they fail to pass her plan, and even though it's not a binding vote, nevertheless, it's going to be a very serious signal that her plan is not going to get passed through Parliament before the deadline in March. Does that lead essentially to complete calamity, chaos, and hard Brexit, as nobody can get their business around and nobody can essentially figure out a way to find a useful compromise? Or does it mean that if essentially this pushes UK into a second referendum? And that actually will be very positive, because the second referendum at this point is going to be handicapped as pro-Remain, and therefore very, very bullish cable. So we have a chance here to go both ways, and it's a complete crapshoot. So you really can't deduce anything from technicals as far as that goes. On the calendar, as we look forward here, a slew of just a smattering of really unimportant data most of the week. We have German trade data, we have UK, whole bunch of UK manufacturing, industrial production. That sort of will be interesting only as a back note. We had very weak UK PMI services data. This was, I think, a major tell of the fact that Brexit is having now real, serious economic impact. Yes, we may have some positive bump in the industrial and manufacturing production because the PMI manufacturing was better, but that's just simply a short-term boost due to currency fluctuation, due to the fact that the pound is just weak. But overall, that's not going to have any kind of impact on pro-pound moves. Into the middle of the week, We get more UK data. We have claimant count and average weekly earnings. That may actually be a very, very important tell, because if that shows weak, those two things, the PMI services and the weaker labor data, especially on the day when Parliament is about to vote, certainly should scare a lot of people into understanding that Brexit is economic suicide for the country. Then into the middle of the week, we get US CPI data, which is expected to be very cool. Not really much of an impact on anything that's going on there. And then finally, into the close of the week, we get retail sales, which is the only really meaningful report out of the US, out of North America this week. That is actually expected to be lower than the month prior. But we are mildly bullish this because essentially Redbook is showing a little bit of an increase in spending. Unless it's a blowout number, it should have very minimal impact on how dollar yen is trading. So overall, I think the economic calendar this week is really very pale. I forgot one thing that happens on Thursday. We have the ECB meeting. That's actually very, very important, only in a sense that the European data is also slowing down, but European monetary policy remains stubbornly hawkish. So if President Draghi really does not back off his statement that European economy continues to expand and that they are on path towards tapering, that there's no chance of any further monetary easing as they go forward, that should actually be positive euro. And we'll see that if we could break those key levels. Let's take a look at the charts here and just see what the levels are. So when we look at the euro, I think the one thing that just jumps out at you very, very strongly is how strong and formidable this base is now building. Not only is the base deep, in other words, the longer the base, the stronger the breakout, but we have a higher low here, a pretty clean, clear higher low, as the lows over here held. Basically, the lows right underneath the 13 held a couple of weeks ago. And we've been trending, we've tested this a couple of times and just been buyers all the way through. Of course, this 14 level has been a very, very tough resistance. Today, actually, what's positive is we're closing into the highs of this resist. That's a strong positive into the week. As a matter of fact, if we go into the weekly candles, let's just take a look at this. You'll see the weekly candle looks, well, it's a tiny candle, but it's closing on the highs of the week. That's a bullish signal. And after a long base, it's kind of a close and a high of the week, generally portends further extension higher. Now, it may take a while. You can see, for example, this is a much bigger candle, but this was a candle also that closed on a higher of the week and really led to a much bigger move here. The weekly candle close tends to give quite a lot of good directionality most of the time. Of course, you're going to get false positives, like you get a move here where you had a up move, but it didn't quite actually close on the highs. So generally, if the weekly candle closes on the highs, that is a very, very strong continuation signal. Even though this is a minor candle, it's only, what's the range here? 113 pips, really tiny, just a very, very tiny range. But nevertheless, the close on the highs, I think, is a good signal for a stronger euro as we go forward. So that's the dailies. Cable, crapshoot, as I can beat this horse perennially, which is that 27 is the Maginot line. We dipped below it just sort of very casually this week, held back, but it's really going to do or die come Tuesday on how the deal goes, and more importantly, how the market interprets it. This is really not how the deal goes, it's how the market interprets the deal. The clean, clear positive, which is a very, very unlikely chance that the deal passes, should push us really through 28, 29, perhaps even 30 on a massive short covering squeeze. But that's very unlikely that's going to happen. So however market decides what the failure of the deal, the failure of the vote interpretation, that's going to be a big story. So we'll be watching that very carefully. It's all going to be very headline driven. The key thing here is if we start breaking 2650, I think that's a very negative tell, especially not just breaking it, but closing. If we close below 2650, that would suggest the market now becomes very fearful of a hard Brexit, and then we could really see 25s very, very shortly in the near future. Dollar yen, talked about the failure. We talked about the failures at lower highs continuously for the last 2 weeks. Today, this week is just no different. The only saving grace here is we sort of held the 12 handle yesterday off of a very, very strong sell-off. Today we have a huge sell-off, another 500-point sell-off in a Dow, and dollar yen just seems to be unfazed. So this risk-off flow is just not having much of an impact. That's perhaps divergence that's mildly positive. And the fact that we hold the 1250 is a pretty decent signal to anybody who wants to kind of bottom fish here for the time being. But if we break the 1200, the story is over. So you could take a punt here on a contrarian basis that it could pop up. But if once the 12 goes, it really starts to test all of this long-term support level, and that is the true distribution level that could push dollar yen much lower. So that's pretty much how the week shapes up. We're going to be watch Brexit front of the week. We're going to watch ECB and the market general sentiment towards FOMC end of the week. Those are going to be the key drivers. I wish you guys the best of luck, best of trading. Boris, over and out.